Right then guys, here I am for my all 7 seasons of career mode video on F1 2010. This is the 5th all seasons of career mode video I've made, but a different one to most. This game's career mode doesn't bear any resemblance to the upgrade heavy career modes of F1 2016 onwards, nor does it have any driver changes like F1 2019, but what this game does have is the tiering system. It's in F1 2012 as well, but this is the genesis of the concept. There is very little information about the tiering system, despite the fact it's on F1 2010 and 2011 and 2012. There are only a few sources that talk about it on F1 2012, whereas in researching for this video, I could only find one webpage that talks about the tiering system on F1 2010. Even then, the original thread isn't available anymore, but you can still get a low resolution copy of the picture that went along with it. It shows each team's starting tier, their overall performance level, and how that alters depending on the tier they're in. It's different to F1 2012, where a top tier team, regardless of their origin, is quick. Hence how both Mercedes and Lotus were able to win the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships once they got into the top tier. Or at the other end of the table, it explains how once Toro Rosso fell down to the bottom tier, they never escaped it. On F1 2010, let's take Lotus, who start off in the bottom tier with an overall performance level of 715. If they finish ahead of the other tier 5 teams, which they should, given that they start off quicker than HRT and Virgin, then they move up to tier 4 and their pace gets upped to 720. Meanwhile, the lowest finishing tier 4 team in the Constructors' Championship, either Sauber or Toro Rosso, get relegated down a tier, and in Toro Rosso's case, they lose 5 performance, but Sauber get to stay at 720. Regardless, either team in their tier 5 state is as good if not better than every other original tier 5 team. There are some oddities, assuming this information is all correct, which I believe it to be, such as that a top tier Mercedes is equal to a top tier McLaren or Red Bull, but a bottom tier Mercedes is better than every other car in its tier 5 form. Also, a tier 1 Lotus is better or equal to most other teams when at tier 1, and a gigantic 15 performance higher than the highest HRT or Virgin can possibly get. A maxed out HRT or Virgin car is only slightly better than the worst a McLaren or Ferrari can ever become. So for the first season, the battles to watch out for are between HRT, Virgin and Lotus in tier 5. Sauber and Toro Rosso will battle to see which one becomes a tier 3 team and which a tier 5 team. Force India and Williams both start in tier 3, Renault, Mercedes and Ferrari all in tier 2, and finally Red Bull and McLaren fight it out to see which one can keep their place in the highest tier. I started off my specified 7 season long career with Virgin, just because they start off as the worst team in the game. Much like in my F1 2012 all 5 seasons of career mode video, I didn't take part in any races purely for the sake of time. It also explains why I didn't want to join a team which would actually be hampered by having me on board, never racing and never scoring any points. At the end of the Korean Grand Prix, Red Bull took the Constructors' Championship with 2 races left to go. One race later in Brazil, Webber won with Button second and Vettel in third. Hamilton finished in 5th, which ruled him out of the championship, but now the 2 Red Bull teammates are only 14 points apart. Jenson Button won the final race of the first season, and Webber crossed the line in 2nd. But Vettel finished in 3rd, meaning he took the Drivers' Championship. He scored 314 points, 11 more than Webber and 34 more than Hamilton. Alonso ended well despite his poor start to the season to take 4th in the championship. Button finished in 5th and Massa is the final driver to end on triple figure points. It's a Mercedes 7-8, with Rosberg beating Schumacher by only 7 points, then a Renault 910 led by Petrov. Kobayashi scored 18 points total to take 11th. Suttel's next with 12 points, and then Buemi and Liuzzi tied on 11. Alguersuari scored only 1 point less than his Toro Rosso teammate, and then it's Della Rosa with 5 points and Barrichello the final point scorer with a single point to his name. 7 drivers in total didn't score any points, including both Lotus, HRT and Virgin drivers, as well as the second Williams driver of Nico Hülkenberg. In the Constructors' Championship, Red Bull scored 617 points, 108 more than McLaren and just shy of 200 more than Ferrari. Mercedes finished in 4th with 163 points, and Renault 5th with 134. BMW Sauber and Force India both got 23 points, but Sauber ended up on top thanks to Kobayashi's particularly impressive season. Toro Rosso were only 2 points behind them, and Williams were the final team to score a point, and it really was just a single point. Lotus, HRT and Virgin, in that order, scored no points, but Lotus finishing top of the new teams means they get promoted up to Tier 4 even though they didn't score a point. Williams finished behind Toro Rosso and Sauber, and yes, they'll have 720 performance by default, but Williams start off in a higher tier yet scored fewer points than they did. Actually, whilst the teams didn't finish in tier order, they did finish in the order of their theoretical performance, with the only exception being that Sauber finished above Force India, despite the fact that BMW Sauber had 720 overall performance and Force India 730. Ultimately though, those battles don't really matter, as all that does is how the teams matched up to the teams in the same tier as themselves. McLaren lost to Red Bull, so get relegated, and Ferrari were the highest placed tier 2 team, so take their place in the top tier. Renault scored fewer points than Mercedes or Ferrari, so go down a tier. Williams couldn't hold a candle to Force India or even any of the teams in the tier below them, but still only get relegated down to tier 4. Toro Rosso, as the worst tier 4 team, go down to tier 5, and Lotus move up to tier 4. So that means the tiers for Season 2 look like this. Williams and Toro Rosso are still on a par in terms of theoretical performance despite the relegations, as they now both have 715 performance instead of 720. That makes Lotus the quickest tier 4 team on paper, and on a par to newly promoted tier 3 BMW Sauber. Renault and Force India directly swap tiers and even performance figures. That is also true with now second tier McLaren, who lost 5 performance after being relegated, whereas Ferrari gained 5 performance through their promotion. Unsurprisingly, Virgin Racing didn't want me anymore, and despite the fact I was told earlier that I needed a level 4 reputation to join HRT, they and Lotus offered me drives for Season 2. The only catch was that they would only pay me $250,000 a year, half what I got from Virgin. I didn't want to impede newly promoted Lotus's progress next season, so I joined HRT instead. Mark Webber won his home Grand Prix, leading a Red Bull 1-2, with Alonso as the best of the rest. What's more interesting is that Renault still scored more points than Force India despite the teams having swapped tiers. Jenson Button for McLaren qualified down in 10th and lost 3 places over the course of the race. Yes, McLaren got relegated, but they still have the definitive 3rd quickest car on the grid, as Hamilton demonstrated at that very same race. The British Grand Prix conjured up a surprising result, with Felipe Massa winning and Nico Rosberg in 2nd place. Webber finished in 3rd, Hamilton 4th, and the second Ferrari of Alonso in 5th. Button finished his home race in 6th, Petrov came across the line in 7th, Schumacher 8th, and then it's the reigning world champion of Sebastian Vettel in 9th. Not only that, but neither Force India driver scored any points whilst in the team's back garden. Despite McLaren now being a 2nd tier team, they still claimed a 1-2 in Yeongam. Alonso took the final podium place, with Vettel in 4th and his teammate Webber in 5th. Even despite the lackluster race, Sebastian Vettel still claimed his second Drivers' Championship in South Korea with 2 races still to go. Webber's nearly 60 points behind him, but only 1 ahead of Alonso and 4 ahead of Hamilton, so the runner-up spot is still very much undecided. Red Bull sealed the Constructors' Championship 1 race later in Brazil, ruling out any possibility of Ferrari taking it away from them. The battle for second in the Drivers' Championship ran all the way to Abu Dhabi, but Alonso came out on top, beating Webber by 8 points and Hamilton by 18. Massa wasn't that far away in the end, and even Button was only 36 points away from second, yet finished in 6th. That's how tight it was for the runner-up spot. Rosberg yet again was the best of the rest, with Kubica this season in 8th, and even Petrov and Liuzzi beat Michael Schumacher. Sutil, Kobayashi, Della Rosa and Barrichello were the final 4 drivers to score points. So this season, neither Virgin, HRT, Lotus or Toro Rosso driver scored a point, and Nico Hülkenberg for Williams didn't either. In the Constructors' Championship, the teams finished where you would expect them to, including Ferrari beating McLaren after the pair swapped tiers. Although to McLaren's credit, they scored 50 points more than Ferrari did the previous season and were only 29 away from second place. Mercedes and Renault finished 4th and 5th again, but with the 2 teams closer together and scoring less points than they did in Season 1. Force India were one of only 2 teams to finish out of place for their performance, as despite the fact they replaced Renault in Tier 2 and had 5 more performance than them, they still couldn't outscore the French team. Force India did improve relative to last year though, scoring 59 points more than they did in the first season and beating Sauber to take 6th in the championship. Williams still scored 2 points, double what they got last year, and despite the relegation, they did better than Lotus, who were in the same tier as Williams and had 5 more performance, yet still couldn't score a single point all season. I got a surprise contract offer from Toro Rosso for $250,000 and to finish 20th in the Drivers' Championship, which I guess proves that they were a bottom tier team. Instead, I rejoined Virgin since they, for some reason, were willing to take me back. Speaking of the tiers, they just so happened to revert back to how they were at the start of the first season. So Season 3 is basically Season 1 Mark II, except there were some odd results which suggested that wasn't actually the case. For example, Jenson Button finishing the first race of the season in 8th, despite McLaren being a top tier team again. Then in the Australian Grand Prix, Williams had an awful race, despite being promoted back up to Tier 3 as Barrichello finished in 19th and Hülkenberg 21st. Also, despite this being a rerun of the first season, there were some surprising events, such as Jaime Alguersuari finishing a rain-soaked Monaco Grand Prix in 7th, even beating Michael Schumacher. Monaco also bore witness to another shocking race for one team, this time BMW Sauber, and it couldn't have been much worse. Kobayashi finished in 21st, behind both HRTs, whilst his teammate Della Rosa was lapped and crossed the line in 23rd, being beaten by everyone. Webber outscoring Vettel by 15 points gave the Aussie the Drivers' Championship lead. Then at the British Grand Prix, pretty much halfway into the season, Alonso took the checkered flag by a 1/10 of a second over Webber, whilst reigning double world champion Vettel finished in 6th. His recent run of poor form has cost him 2nd place in the Drivers' Championship to Fernando Alonso. I got caught out with just how early Red Bull claimed the Constructors' Championship, as after the Singapore Grand Prix they were exactly 200 points ahead of Ferrari with 4 races of the season still to run. In fact, Tier 2 Ferrari were ahead of Tier 1 McLaren, albeit by only 2 points. The Drivers' Championship battle was as close as could be, with Webber leading by 1 point over Vettel upon leaving South Korea, and then Vettel won the Brazilian Grand Prix with Webber second, to give Vettel a 6-point advantage with 1 race left to go. In essence, as long as Webber wins the final race of the season, there's nothing Vettel can do to keep his championship lead. Red Bull locked out the front row in Yas Marina and they took a 1-2 in the end. They finished where they started, which means Vettel won the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and with it, his 3rd Drivers' Championship on the bounce. Fernando Alonso's championship charge crumbled towards the end, as seen with a weak 6th place at Yeongam behind his teammate Massa in 4th. Although the lowlight for the Scuderia was an 8th place from Fernando at Suzuka, whilst Massa could only muster 13th in the 3rd quickest car on the grid. Alonso did still cling on to 3rd in the championship, just. He scored only 4 points more than Hamilton, which in fairness is amazing given that Hamilton had indisputably the quicker car. Kubica excelled as he beat Schumacher for the 2nd season in a row. Meanwhile, Hülkenberg finally scored a point, whereas Barrichello didn't, and so had his 1st pointless season in this video, and only his 2nd pointless season in his entire Formula 1 career. Buemi arguably had the worst season of all though, as he didn't score any points, despite the fact he scored 11 in the 1st season and Alguersuari scored 6 this season. Whilst the amount of points scored may be different, quite drastically so in some cases, the Constructors' Championship ended in almost exactly the same order it did in Season 1. The only changes are that Force India beat Sauber, which means all the teams finished in performance order. The only exception to that was HRT, who were deemed to have had the best season of the pointless teams, beating Lotus. Because Season 3 ended in almost exactly the same way Season 1 did, the Season 4 tiers are almost identical to how they were in Season 2. Force India beating BMW Sauber makes no difference, as they were in different tiers, but HRT beating Lotus does. So the only difference from the 2nd to 4th season is that HRT got promoted, not Lotus. The annoying thing for Hispania is that the promotion nets them a performance gain of 0. So in essence, their car will be exactly as uncompetitive as it was before, except now they have the tough task of beating Williams rather than Lotus and Virgin. I joined HRT to make my debut in a higher tier team, since Virgin wanted me out the door again. The Hispania Racing team peaked at one of their 2 home races, as Bruno Senna finished the European Grand Prix in Valencia in 14th. That's largely because both Williams started on the 2nd to last row and Barrichello made up only 1 position during the race, whilst Hülkenberg didn't even achieve that. You can tell HRT went up a tier, as apparently they expected me to qualify in the top 10 and finish in the top 8. Those are some extremely hard objectives to meet in any tier 4 car, but to do that in a tier 4 HRT, which is the same as it was in tier 5, is comically over-optimistic. With 2 races to go, a clear champion still hadn't emerged, as Webber had the championship lead by 1 point over Alonso, and Vettel was only 11 points down on his teammate. Even Hamilton was in contention, and only 6 behind the triple world champion. In Interlagos, Webber took the full 25 points, with Hamilton 2nd, Alonso 3rd and Vettel 4th. Those results essentially turned the Drivers' Championship from a 4-horse to a 2-horse race, with Webber now having an 11-point advantage over Alonso. Hamilton and Vettel levelled up on points, with Hamilton given 3rd on account of having the better finishing record. Fernando Alonso won the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which meant Webber just needed a podium finish to keep his lead. That's exactly what he did, as he crossed the line only 2.1 seconds after the Ferrari driver to win his first World Drivers' Championship by a mere 4 points. Sebastian Vettel, the man who won the previous 3 titles, finished 4th in the championship, even behind Hamilton in the 2nd tier McLaren. Button ended the season in 5th with Massa 6th, and then it's a Mercedes 7-8, with Rosberg taking his usual spot of 7th in the championship. Kubica finished in 9th, scoring 46 points, whereas Petrov could only accrue 9. Both Williams drivers grabbed a point each, and finally, neither Toro Rosso, Lotus, Virgin or HRT drivers scored a point. With this being a repeat of Season 2, the Constructors' Championship ended almost exactly the same way, although it was much closer this time around as Tier 2 McLaren were closer to Tier 1 Ferrari than before, and Red Bull didn't do as well as last time, but still well enough to take their 4th Constructors' Championship on the bounce. The only change involved Force India, who were able to use their promotion and Renault's relegation to beat the French team, which they didn't do in Season 2. That means the teams finished in performance order exactly, with Williams the best of the 3 teams with 715 pace, and even HRT beat Virgin despite me being there. Season 5 was a return to Season 3, which itself was a return to Season 1. So because the tiers reverted to their defaults yet again, this is essentially Season 1 Mark III. There's so little to talk about in the 5th season that honestly one of the most interesting things is that I joined now Tier 4 Toro Rosso. Having spent multiple seasons with the new teams, driving the Toro Rosso was a pleasure. When I drove the HRT for the first time, I noticed a tangible improvement over the Virgin. That's how awful the worst car is. But the Toro Rosso is in a different league. It's more stable and planted than the HRT and especially Virgin. Honestly, you drive that Virgin as if you're constantly balancing on a knife edge of grip. In the Toro Rosso, I made up 5 positions in 1 lap, including passing a Williams for the first time in my career. The top story of the season was HRT's first ever points. I don't know when or how they did it, but they scored 2 points, with the 2nd worst car on the grid. What I can answer is who, and the man who did it is Bruno Senna, who brings himself level on points with Rubens Barrichello as well as my teammate Alguersuari. Red Bull rediscovered the level of domination they started this career with, as they mathematically secured the Constructors' Championship in South Korea with 2 races to spare. Felipe Massa got into his stride and won his home Grand Prix by 0.9 seconds over Vettel. Heading into the final race, Mark Webber had only a 3 points lead on Vettel, but the championship will be won by a Red Bull driver as Button is now mathematically out of contention but is also guaranteed 3rd place. Despite Webber starting on the front row in Abu Dhabi, he didn't even get on the podium. Meanwhile, his opposite number did, and added another race win to his rapidly growing total. It's also Vettel's 4th Drivers' Championship in 5 seasons, as he beat Webber by 10 points. Jenson Button had his best season with a 3rd place championship finish, besting Alonso and Hamilton by just shy of 40 points. From Massa downwards, the championship ended almost identically to the 3rd season, apart from the fact Kobayashi and Alguersuari swapped places, and let's not forget Bruno Senna's miracle that gave HRT 2 points. That certainly hasn't happened before. The Constructors' Championship finished in exactly the same order as it did in Season 3. The only difference being that the field was arguably slightly closer than before, which is demonstrated best by HRT scoring the first ever points for the new teams. The tiers for Season 6 are exactly the same as they were in Season 4, and I went and joined Virgin for the 3rd time since I didn't want to get in the way of now Tier 4 HRT. Also, for some unexplained reason, my teammate is now Timo Glock instead of Lucas de Grassi. There's very little to talk about in Season 6, so let's get straight into the British Grand Prix, which was a roaring success for Ferrari. It was a 1-2 led by Alonso, and after that round, Alonso led the Drivers' Championship 26 points ahead of second, and Felipe Massa is fourth in the championship ahead of both McLarens and only 8 points behind Vettel. Not much changed between then and Brazil, with the only major development being that Red Bull took the lead of the Constructors' Championship away from Ferrari. The fight does technically go to the final round, but to all intents and purposes, Red Bull had already won it. Same can be said for Alonso in the Drivers' Championship, who had a healthy 16-point gap over Webber, who's the only other driver still in contention. In Abu Dhabi, it became official. Fernando Alonso is now a triple world champion and is the first non-Red Bull driver to win a championship in this career save. Vettel finished in third, with Massa in the respectable 4th place and 239 points to his name, which is 7 more than Hamilton and 34 more than Button. Rosberg takes his 6th consecutive 7th place in the championship, with Schumacher yet again forming the back end of a Mercedes 7-8. Kubica had a poor season by his standards, as he was outscored by both Force India drivers led by Sutil. Petrov got together 21 points, whilst Rubens Barrichello, still at Williams, scored a mighty 5 points for the Oxfordshire-based team. That is in addition to 2 points from Hulkenberg, which makes this season Williams' best in this video. Finally, the usual suspects all scored no points, along with Sebastian Buemi and, most interestingly, Pedro de la Rosa, who got none whilst Kobayashi scored 4. In the Constructors' Championship, Red Bull secured their 6th one on the bounce, by 30 points over Ferrari. The top 6 teams finished in the same places they did in Season 4, but Williams scoring 7 points, almost double that of BMW-backed Sauber, means this is Williams' highest finishing position to date. Toro Rosso scored 2 points, despite being a bottom tier team, and HRT utilised their position in Tier 4 to finish top of the 3 pointless teams. It didn't stop them getting relegated though. You've guessed it, the tiers for the final season are exactly the same as they started out, so Season 7 can be fairly dubbed as Season 1 Mark IV. For the sake of variety, I joined Lotus, meaning I've raced for every single one of the new teams to 2010. Lotus's car felt pretty decent compared to the rubbish I've driven in previous seasons, and whilst it did feel down on power, it is grippy and predictable to drive compared to the HRT or especially Virgin, which felt jittery at high speed. I also turned the races up to 100% distance, just in the hopes it might change how the season plays out. Vettel won the Monaco Grand Prix, taking the Drivers' Championship lead away from Hamilton and Webber, albeit by the tightest of margins, as both Red Bull drivers sat on 103 points. Lewis Hamilton won the British Grand Prix, and this was just the latest in a series of races where Hamilton outscored Vettel and Webber, as halfway into the final season, his championship lead over second place Webber was 24 points. The Season 7 Singapore Grand Prix was the highlight of the career, and I don't know whether it was the increased race distances that caused it, but it was a McLaren 1-2 led by Hamilton, with Pedro de la Rosa in a Tier 4 Sauber somehow taking the final step on the podium. Vitaly Petrov crossed the line in a deeply impressive 4th for Renault, with Vettel in 5th, Rosberg 6th, Webber 7th, Kubica 8th, Alonso all the way down in 9th, and finally, Jarno Trulli dragged Lotus into the final points place. With Lotus getting their first ever Formula 1 championship point, that means every team on the grid has done it except Virgin. At Interlagos, the second to last race of the career, Red Bull just about secured their 7th Constructors' title, but McLaren put up a good fight and were much closer to them than they were to Ferrari, who were over 170 points off the top. In terms of the driver's title, Hamilton had more or less secured his second championship at the same venue he won his first back in 2008. Vettel is 1 point too far back, and whilst Webber is closer, he still has to overhaul a 22 points deficit in just one race. Unsurprisingly, that didn't happen, although what did was Robert Kubica ending this 133 race run with an impressive 5th place, beating the likes of Rosberg, Alonso and Schumacher. Lewis Hamilton won the Drivers' Championship, taking it off of Alonso and becoming only the 2nd non-Red Bull driver to win during this career. But with this being the 7th season, that makes the year 2016, the one year in recent history in which Hamilton didn't win the championship in real life. There's little else to say, although Vettel pulled off another minor miracle as he outscored Webber by 13 points in the final round to take 2nd in the championship. Nico Rosberg finished every single season 7th in the championship. You then have to drop down to 16th place before it gets interesting again, as Bruno Senna scored another 2 points for HRT. Honestly, Senna scoring 4 points total for HRT is probably the most impressive thing to happen in this video. More so than Jarno Trulli's miracle point in the quicker Lotus, and better than Kovalainen, Chandok, Glock and Degrassi, who never scored any points. Although in their defence, none of them did the full 7 seasons due to me hopping from team to team. The Constructors' Championship for the final season ends almost identically to how it did during the very first season, something which really couldn't have been said in my F1 2012 All Seasons video. The only changes are that HRT's 2 points put the Tier 5 team ahead of the Tier 3 team of Williams, who follow up their best season with their worst. Lotus scored 1 point even with me on board, which put them in 11th, and Virgin spent 7 long years to make exactly 0 progress. They started as the worst team, and that never at any point changed. As for how the career mode ends, well, I never get to find out what I did with my $3.5 million. And actually, I'm amazed I got paid that much, and that's only because I started inexplicably getting pay rises. So at the end of my career, I was getting paid more than my starting salary, even though that was rightly slashed in half at the end of my debut season. The credits roll, and then it's like Groundhog Day. I go back to the press conference the game starts off with, and I have to tell everyone my name again. 7 seasons on F1 2010, and Red Bull won every single Constructors' Championship. Some of them were closely contested, some of them they walked. Sure, there eventually was some variety in the Drivers' Championship winners, with Alonso and Hamilton winning the final 2, but ultimately the Red Bull drivers shared the first 5. Even then, shared is a pretty poor choice of word, since Vettel became a quadruple world champion, whereas Webber only won 1 championship. Sure, it's 1 more title than the Aussie won in the real world, but that's not much of a counter-argument. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like, comment down below, and I'll see you guys at some point in the future. Hopefully not August 2020 as the upload dates for the F1 2010 and 2012 videos would suggest, for the completion of the trilogy of all seasons of career mode videos with F1 2011.